Hey people, welcome to Roll20 Con, 2 days of gaming for charity. We're going to be playing a whole bunch of games the next few days, including Kids on Bikes, Pathfinder 2nd Edition, and even a game creator panel. In preparation for a special announcement happening this weekend, we designed this cool shirt. All sales benefit TakeThis.org, and you can pick that up now on Teespring, but you gotta hurry. It'll only be available until October 18th. Speaking of celebration, we've also decided to unlock dynamic lighting on the site. So, if you've always wanted to try out dynamic lighting, tag your game with Roll20 Con, and that feature will be unlocked for you. We also have an exclusive art pack that some of our favorite creators put together. That's available on our marketplace with a donation to Take This. Coming up next, we have a mental health panel hosted by Dr. B from TakeThis.org.
Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to this very special panel that Roll20 has been kind enough to let us run on their channel during Roll20 Con. I'm Dr. B, the clinical director of Take This. For those of you who don't know about Take This yet, we are the first mental health nonprofit to serve the game community, and we're also happily the beneficiaries of Roll20's wonderful generosity this weekend. So make sure to go and check out all the t-shirt, the wonderful t-shirt that they have for sale. I will be ordering mine, as well as the art pack and anything else they've got going on. And we've got plenty of mental health resources over at takethis.org if you are curious. So with me today are two very good friends and wonderful colleagues, Dr. Kelli Dunlap and Dr. McConnell. Hello.
Hello.
And we are here to talk about mental health in tabletop RPGs. Y'all ready to do that?
Yes. Let's do it.
Yeah. Well, first of all, let's start because Dr. Kelli is at the top of my screen. Want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So again, my name is Kelli Dunlap. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. And after doctor school, I went and got a master's in game design as well. So I am both a psychologist and a game designer. That's kind of the short version. No big.
Well, what do you do with games these days?
Oh, wow. So I work at a nonprofit called I Thrive Games, and we are an organization that focuses on using games and game design to help teens live their best lives, to develop through social and emotional learning and skills. And so that's what I do in my full-time job. I also teach part-time at American University in their graduate program for game design. So I'm currently teaching games history and society to a group of wonderful master's and MFA students. And then in all the other spare time, I get to play games every now and then. There's a joke in game design that once you learn how to make games, you never have time to play them. I feel like that's pretty true. And I have a wonderful family. I have a cute little 3-year-old that keeps me busy. And I'm currently the foster mom to a puppy, she's a mama dog now. She's a mama dog and her 3-week-old puppies. So that also keeps me very busy.
And if you follow Dr. Kelli on Twitter, I'm sure you will see pictures of those puppies.
Yes. Yeah. There's pre-puppy Twitter and then there's post-puppy Twitter. And yeah, if you need to pick me up, there's just puppies everywhere.
They are so adorable.
Thank you.
Well, and so Dr. Megan.
Hi, I'm Dr. McConnell. I'm a board-certified psychologist practicing in Charlotte, North Carolina. I'm also the co-founder of Geeks Like Us, the writer, producer, and host of Psychology at the Table, the Dungeon Master for Clinical Role, a live play D&D game where all of my players are other therapeutic dungeon masters and psychologists. I also run a private practice, and I'm a therapeutic dungeon master running 3 different therapy groups where we use Dungeons and Dragons as a therapy tool.
And in addition to that, you are my co-author on an original training that we built.
Yes, and I do that. And I have a family, and sometimes I play games. I do a lot of things. I'm writing chapters and books and things now too.
And DMing clinical role.
Yeah.
So not much going on.
No, not a lot.
Well, so okay. Let's just, before we get into the hard-hitting questions, very hard-hitting questions, what's your background, both of you, in just RPGs? What do you do for fun? What have you done for fun? What kind of characters do you like to play? Do you have a favorite set of dice?
Oh, geez. Okay. So most of my RPG background is digital. I hope that's not like blasphemous. But like my favorite RPG of all time is definitely Skyrim. I have put so many hours into Skyrim, and that is my RPG of choice. I've only recently come to tabletop, probably in the last 2 years, so it's been definitely a strong learning curve. I took said training that together, and so I got to be a student.
Oh no!
That. So I don't have a set of dice.
Uh-oh.
Kelly's freezing on us.
We're losing.
I like them very much. Cool. Why?
You're freezing, Dr. Kelly.
No. Those sounded like such great answers.
Is that better?
Uh-oh. Well, while we figure that out, let's ask Dr. Megan the same thing. What's your background with RPGs? I mean, obviously use them as a part of your career. What kind of games do you like to play? Do you have a favorite set of dice? What characters do you play? Lay it on us.
So started playing D&D back in middle school. So I'm from the way before times when we used to do our character sheets on notebook paper.
What's paper?
Yes. Been playing in an ongoing campaign every Sunday now we're getting ready to hit 4 years, I think. So I play every Sunday. I get to play Torena, the Bard Warlock, who's a punk rock silver dragonborn and is awesome to play. I love playing bards. I think bards are just so much fun because you can do a lot of damage, but you also get to support the party and you get to have a lot more fun with the social interactions and things. I really do love dungeon mastering now, though. It's this interesting thing of like in the last couple of years, like I've definitely hit this point where I feel like the area behind the screen is mine and really owning that. Dungeons and Dragons, of course, is my favorite system now because it's the one I have the most time in. I've got a few other systems that I'm trying to play with my younger humans in my house. We have the My Little Pony system, which I think we're going to try to play. And then we've also got No Thank You Evil and some others. So I try to dabble in a few of them.
Nice.
And I do not have a favorite set of dice because, like, how can you pick just like look at the big ones and then you've got the pretty metal one? Like, how do you just pick one? They're all beautiful and they all roll so lovely and they're all my friends. I'm totally a dragon when it comes to my dice.
You are a dice dragon.
Yeah, I've got more bags of dice down, like I have bags of dice set aside for my next campaign, the next character I'm going to play. They already have specific dice for that character. So.
I know you and I have hit the point where we may have dice on us at any given point. There's about a 50-50 chance.
Yeah.
Well, so back to Dr. Kelly. Hopefully we don't have lagging this time. So tell us a little bit about your RPG background. And I know you've even been involved in the development of one.
Yeah, so RPG background is mostly digital. I don't know if it came across before I dropped, but Skyrim, I have put an obscene amount of time into Skyrim. It's probably my favorite ever. I'm pretty new, relatively speaking, to tabletop role-playing games, likely within the last year or two, because I was asked to make one. And I hadn't really done anything in the space before then. And it became a research project that involved, playing and working and researching. And so I've definitely dug in, but still very new to the space, still learning a ton. And in terms of favorite dice, I only have one set. Again, speaking to my newbiness, and they're purple, and I really, really dig them because they're purple. That's my favorite.
Oh, that's awesome. One of us.
Converted.
So, well, let's just get into the meat of it then. Like, why do you care so much about the way mental health is portrayed in games? And I know, Dr. Kelly, you have a broader scope in both electronic and tabletop games. Because after all, it's just a game, right? Why do we care?
Why do we care about games?
Yeah, I mean, it's just a game. Who cares who cares about how mental health is portrayed?
So I guess I will unpack that in two steps. One, we care about games because games are both meaningful and meaningless. They are a play experience outside of our ordinary life experience, and therefore we get to do things and accomplish things and explore things that we can't do in real life. Whether that's waking up well rested, whether that's slaying a dragon, all these things that are elusive when we don't get kind of the good feelings that we get when we play a game, because they enable us to be our best selves and to explore our best selves. And so that's why we care about games. That's why we care about play. We care about, I'll speak for myself. I care about mental health in games, obviously because I'm a game designer and a psychologist, but also because I think mental health is very special in terms of vulnerable populations being portrayed generally in media, but mostly, at least my focus is on games, is, we as a society don't talk about mental health at all. And it is entirely possible that someone's very first or possibly only experience that they're aware of mental health representation is through a media form, including games. When we think about, say, violence in games or gender representation in games, typically people are taught from a very young age to not hurt other people, to, not run over pedestrians, to, not beat people up. We're taught norms around the different things that you can do in games, but we don't really do that with mental health. And so if somebody doesn't have a frame of reference, if they don't have a solid foundation in what is accurate and what is like a problematic stereotype, then the representation matters a lot more because it can have a greater impact.
So, Dr. Megan, how about you? We hear this defense, quote unquote, all the time, that it's just a game. Who cares? So mental health in RPGs, why do we care?
Well, I think Dr. Kelli put it very, very well. Like, it's a lot about kind of breaking through stigmas and giving a good introduction and helping people. Because if you think about, a lot of times our understanding of the world is through the media we consume, whether that be games or television or movies or books. And it's helpful to have an accurate representation. It doesn't have, nothing has to be like real life accurate when you're in the entertainment industry. I mean, a lot of artists, I think, will want to make it that way so that it can feel more real. But it's really helpful to give somebody the tools to understand what something is. It's, as Kelli put it perfectly, is like it sometimes is our only exposure to something. And we might have never, we've heard of PTSD, but maybe have never interacted with somebody that we know has PTSD. And what's that going to look like? And artist and fantasy author I was talking to once saying that in their books, one of the things that they do is they really try to think about what skills they would love to teach their readers, and say, like, this is an opportunity for somebody to experience something that hopefully they never have to experience in real life, where we can actually teach some skills of survival or of getting through trauma in a positive way. And so in a lot of ways, our games can also model how to behave in life. If you think about early play in childhood, a lot of it is, playing house, playing different jobs, and it's modeling how we're supposed to behave in society and kind of practicing. And so in a lot of ways, that's what an RPG can be as well. It's like practicing, how do we treat other people well? And what do we do to treat people well?
Okay. Well, and certainly we have, there's no shortage of bad examples. I mean, especially in media, media throughout history. And even this weekend, we have the launch of the new Joker movie, which I haven't seen, but I will say I'm a little wary of. Just the Joker as a character is kind of antithetical to a lot of what we try and teach at Take This about violence and mental illness. But of course, so we have tropes. Mm-hmm. And I know Dr. Kelli has a lot to say
I don't know what you
on
mean.
the kind of tropes that she hates.
So I may have a piece where I wrote out, I think it was 4 or 5 specific tropes that need to die, like burn them with fire and launch them into the sun and then throw the sun into a black hole. That's kind of how I feel.
There's got to be a spell for that, right?
Yeah.
You tell me.
Probably a level 8 spell somewhere along the way.
All right. Well, considering I'm still negative, like level -1, I'll get there. But in terms of like the biggest offenders, the first one that's most common and so annoying is the idea of the villain as an evil genius, a mad scientist, or just the idea that because they are quote unquote crazy, that excuses the writers from having any other kind of development. Like Kefka from like Final Fantasy. The entire purpose of Kefka wanting to destroy the world is because he's quote unquote crazy. And that trope is everywhere. So not only is it upsetting because it ties together the stigma of, people with mental illness as being inherently violent, which is abjectly false. Someone with a mental illness is 10 times more likely to be the victim of violence than someone in the general population. And of all the violent crime, only I think it's 2% can actually be attributed to mental illness. So that's a very pervasive trope that's incredibly damaging, but it's so prevalent. And so killing that with fire would be great. Another
or
one
wish
that
spell, as
or wish spell.
as somebody in the chat pointed out, that wish would be a pretty effective way of getting rid of that one.
Yep. So I also think it's lazy writing. Instead of actually making a character that has depth and dimensionality, you just slap a cultural lighthouse on it, basically saying, hey, mental illness, now you know everything you need to, and I don't actually have to write anything. And that leads me into my second most least favorite, which is the use of psychiatric hospitals, insane asylums as a location for horror games. If there was a horror game that came out that didn't have it, it'd be great. And if I never saw another psychiatric institution used to host a horror game, whether that's digital or tabletop, that would be amazing. But the reason that it's used is because you see an insane asylum, a mental health institution, and there is a cultural shorthand of be afraid. And the question I always like to ask is, have you ever had your character wake up in a mental hospital and had something good happen to you? And I don't think anybody's ever said yes to that question. And that's because it is a cultural focal point of this is shorthand because it's so entrenched in our society and understanding of mental health that this is bad, this is scary. So that can also get nuked into the sun. And then I guess the last one, I could go on, but
I know you can. This is why you're here.
The last one I would pick is the use of Grant. Can you please wait a moment, please? Grant, can you give mommy 2 minutes? Go get daddy. Where's your daddy? You can't find daddy. Grant, can you pull it? The last thing I'll say is the use of pejorative language, like literally calling your people psychos. And I'm going to go help a small child.
This is effective parenting in action, folks. You're getting free parenting lessons from mental health professionals.
You also have to be parents.
So, Dr. Megan, how about you? Yeah. What are some that, because obviously, Dr. Kelli brings up the idea of these being cultural artifacts. Even the term bedlam is linked to one of the most ancient psychiatric facilities in the world, Bedlam Hospital.
Yeah.
So, what are some tropes that you would just like to see go away?
Well, I think Kelli, was talking about it well with that idea of like, just because somebody's insane, that will excuse a lot. And it's something I like to think about a lot too, of how we're explaining a character's struggles with something versus the reality of like what we really see. And if we add a really complicated thing into it, like the rules system and the lore of Dungeons and Dragons, it does become a lot more complicated. Because if you read about something like wizards, right? So for those who, I'm assuming most of the audience plays D&D, but as a wizard, you learn magic spells, you have them in your book, but you can only hold so many magic spells in your head in a day, because to try and hold more would break your mind. Because as a wizard, you are not really meant to hold magic. You have just learned mental discipline enough to be able to hold magic, which I think is really interesting. And it's something different than, what we're talking about, like with mental illness. And like a few smaller tropes that really get under my skin and are frustrating to me. Like the idea that if you're anxious, you're completely crippled and you can't do anything. Like somebody who's nervous or scared can't go out and face things and still be a useful member of the party and still be of help to people. And I was actually thinking about this too, because started thinking about like the fear condition at D&D. And I actually think that it does a fairly good job of showing a fear response, because something that creates the fear condition, you have disadvantage attacking it and you can't move closer to it consciously, but you still can function. You can still operate. You can attack other things. You can attack, but at disadvantage. You can try to assist your allies. So even though you're struggling, you're still useful and valuable. And so that's something I wish we could build on more and bring that out more.
Well, and I know that actually matches some real life statistics. I looked at, I want to say it was a National Institute of Health statistic, and that only 6% of those diagnosed with mental health diagnoses are truly crippled in their lives. 94% of people will retain at least some, if not an incredible degree of functionality throughout the entirety of their life. And so what you're speaking to is the idea that just because someone in game has a diagnosis, they are now useless.
Yeah. Yeah. And we see that a lot, where like, if you think to a lot of sitcoms and stuff, it'll be like, okay, here's our mental illness one, where this character A is suddenly depressed and they're going to go through therapy, and then we can't do anything with character A until they're cured. I could think several shows have done things like that. The one that's popping in my head is an 80s show. I think it was Family Ties did that.
Did Family Ties did that?
I think so. Yeah.
Did Alex Keaton have depression? Or
it's something like that. I can't remember, but it's like, it was one of those things where like, even as a kid, it was such a trope of an episode. Like I'd be like, oh, it's one of these episodes where we're in a mental, someone's getting counseling and they're going through all this stuff and talking with a psychologist. And then at the end of it, end of 30 minutes, they'll be cured. And then we never talk about that anxiety or depression they had again.
Right. Well, and this brings to mind one that is just it's related to one that Dr. Kelli brought up, and it's just a serious pet peeve of mine. And that is the trope of the malevolent mental health worker. I don't know about you two, but have you really ever met someone who goes into mental health therapy, any sort of thing, that has malicious intent towards anybody? I mean, I'm thinking about the idea. Yes, I will get rich performing experiments.
Yes.
What?
Yes, Hannibal
Lecter.
Lecter.
I'm impressed that you met Hannibal Lecter and lived to tell the tale.
Redheads were not very tasty. It's the lack of soul. Yeah. We don't brown well,
Yeah.
I hear you. I'm told that redheads brown fantastically. Or is it just burn easily?
Burn, yeah. Burn.
Oh, okay.
Oh, there you
go. Sorry.
Right.
But I mean,
Right,
thinking, and somebody in the chat brings up the idea of Nurse Ratched.
Ugh.
And as good as Louise Fletcher's performance was, it doesn't really represent the realities of therapy, of a psychiatric facility. Like, what would you say to people about that?
Well, I mean, I think one of the things too we have to keep in mind with Nurse Ratched's example too is the time, right? Because that was before we had the big deinstitutionalization where people because like up until I'm going to get my date wrong, 1970 something, right?
Well, the book was written in the 60s. Ken Kesey wrote that in the 60s.
Right, but no, I think we stopped institutionalizing people in the 70s in the U.S.
I
right?
think it was Ronald Reagan's defunding that really.
Yeah, and so like it was just they're horrible places, where we weren't treating people like people, and like was it gosh, it was Dr. Horney was the first one to really work on bonding with patients.
Yeah, Karen Horney.
Karen Horney, yes.
Yeah.
And it was such a change because like we have this tendency as humans to try and look at people with something wrong with them or something not going the way we expect it as other. That can't be me. I have to dehumanize this person because it's a threat to my understanding of self and who I am as a person. And the truth is that everybody's a human. We all have different motivations for things. We all interpret things differently. There's this quote from Maya Angelou I bring up in therapy a lot, which is, when you see somebody doing something horrible to another person, don't ever say, I will never do that, because that person is a human doing that horrible thing. And you are a human too. And you have the same capacity for love and hate as every other human out there. And like, it's such an important thing, because, how we've treated like these tropes around mental illness is we're dehumanizing people. And not just mental illness too, like physical disabilities as well. We see as other, those people type things. And it's wrong, and it's just to understand and to have that compassion of, we're all humans, and it's, I don't know, it's hard. And like, the point I was trying to bring up though, with talking about like thinking about the time of when Nurse Ratched was written as a character and what that was like in those institutions, like, those are pretty hopeless places. People were just put in there and forgotten. And we know from Philip Zimbardo's work that being in a bad situation starts to create bad apples. People who can go in with a wonderful intent can have some really catastrophic outcomes, and it can be really hard. And so to understand too the importance of being in good places, and like, most places now are actually wonderful facilities that really try to help people, and everybody working there is, we take big steps to make sure that we're taking care of ourselves, to check in with ourselves. We're all psychologists, and part of our ethics code is check yourself. If you're not doing well, take care of yourself, because if you don't take care of you, you can't take care of others.
Well, and ultimately, of course, do no harm. I mean, this is supposed
Yes.
to be a helping profession.
Yes.
And it's not even just do no harm. Like, there's beneficence as well as non-malfeasance. Non-malfeasance being do no harm. Beneficence is actively do good.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And I think this just speaks to the wider cultural narrative that games are about things, and games are cultural artifacts that convey the values of the people who created them. The same thing with books, the same thing with literature. That's what you see with Nurse Ratched. Like, that's was the contemporary idea at the time. Think about The Sopranos. Tony Soprano going to see a therapist was earth-shattering. It really was. There was this huge opening of people more willing to talk about therapy, because you had this mob boss, this fictional mob boss, even though his relationship with his therapist was not entirely ethical either. And then you have, in Grand Theft Auto 5, there's Dr. Isaiah Friedlander, who is incredibly unethical. But to me, the idea that your character could go see a therapist, that to me is really exciting. Because then at least if someone comes in, and at least there's something that you have in common to talk about, that they've had some exposure. It's not great. And you can talk about all the ways that it's not great. But I would almost rather have that, at least in terms of the mental health provider, not in terms of the mental health stigma representation, but in terms of the mental health provider, because at least I can speak to that and I can address that. Games are about things, and they mean things. And I think that's important to understand and to really value.
Well, on a little bit of an aside, for many of the people in the chat who have seen some of the work that all of us have done, they're probably aware of the fact that about 4 or 5 months ago, TakeThis, in conjunction with a couple of really fantastic one community writer, Hannah Rose, and one associate producer at Wizards of the Coast, Bill Benham, created and released a charity module that was mental health themed called Gardens of Fog. It's available on the DM's Guild. And one of the things that's a part of that is a character that is based on the mascot at TakeThis, the Psychomancer. And it was specifically written in that this Psychomancer, who's a mind cleric, only gets their powers if they act within the realm of not only trying not to do no harm, but benefiting others. They have to use their powers to truly help others. They can't use their powers for evil means. Otherwise, they lose their powers, which could be an interesting plot point in and of itself. Specifically, that was meant to be like the disciplinary board for licensure and all that. You could go on cleric probation and lose your cleric license. And then you have to go, you have to do your continuing ed, and you have to now, earn your cleric license back. But thinking about this stuff, are there any representations in role-playing games? Or, I know, Dr. Kelli, that you have more of a background in video games, but are there any representations in role-playing games that you think do a really good job of talking about or representing mental health challenges?
I mean, I not that I've come across. Let me rephrase. I have seen people take existing tabletop games and put on their own house rules to make them really amazing, powerful experiences. I mean, first and foremost, you and Dr. Megan, I mean, like you guys do that all the time in your therapy sessions. The Adams from Game to Grow do the same thing. They take the existing systems and they adjust them enough so that they can get what they want across. In the games that I've just casually played, like the very first one that pops into mind is, I always get the name wrong, Haunting at House on the Hill at Haunted House, that one?
Oh, the Avalon Games.
House on Haunted Hill? Maybe that's it.
Well, that's the movie. The Betrayal at the House on the Hill.
Yes, I always forget the word betrayal. Yes, that one. Like I think of that, and then I'm always disappointed because there's a sanity meter. And that's something that transcends both digital games and board games, is that the use of sanity meters is if your mental health is a dipstick that you can just measure good or bad, running low, let's fill you up. And so I don't know of any that are specifically called out in that way. But one of the things that I really do love about the tabletop space is that if you have a DM who wants to go there, like there's no limit. You could do whatever you wanted. You know, in a video game, I'm bound by the code. I'm actually less.
Right.
I have more limitations in a video game to what I can do as a player because of the code. Whereas when I'm playing a tabletop game, I could do anything. I could be anyone. I could go anywhere. I could make anything happen as the DM. And that to me is what's the most exciting. So even if someone's not directly like addressing that issue through their game, through their game mechanics, the possibility space that allows us to use it in that way, I think is almost the perfect medium.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What about you, Dr. Megan? What do you are there any examples you can think of, either modules or game systems that have done mental health really well, or people that you've seen doing mental health representation well?
I've definitely seen some people doing mental health representation well. I can't think specifically of so again, like I know D&D really well. And I have like so many other gaming systems books, and I'm always like, I'm gonna read that this weekend. I haven't. I'm so sorry to Kids on Bikes and Outbreak Undead and the Cypher system, which I think actually might have some good stuff. And I know Pathfinder has been actively trying to be more inclusive, but again, I haven't read any of them, so I'm sorry. But I would say, like, if anybody's watches Critical Role in here, Liam O'Brien plays a character, Caleb, who struggles with most likely post-traumatic stress. And they handle it really well in the game. And I think it's represented really well. It's not like this big overdone thing. It's what it would basically be in real life, is a sort of subtle, and it's kind of a hit or miss. Sometimes he gets flashbacks, sometimes he doesn't. And it's comes to the dungeon master knowing how to handle that well, coming up with a system that worked for them, and the player being able to handle it as well. And so that one is done really, really well, I think.
Okay. Well, I know that Dr. Kelli, I've heard Dr. Kelli speak on this multiple times, and this is, again, part of the reason that you're both here, because I know this is a huge concern for both of you. But one of the things that Dr. Kelli has said, and correct me if I get this wrong, is that it's oftentimes better to take a sort of artistic slice or representation of things to basically come at it a little sideways than to try and make it literal in a game.
Oh, so it ultimately depends on what your goal is. And so when I've talked with game designers who want to approach this topic, typically they want to do it like very directly of, okay, if I'm going to make a game about PTSD, I'm going to make something like Spec Ops: The Line, where there are hallucinations, there's delusions, there's flashbacks, there's all the active psychological symptoms that scream mental illness. So that 100% what you're getting into. But if your goal is to help people think about mental health, if you're trying to get across some kind of message or experience or develop empathy for someone, I, at least as in my experience, have found that taking an abstract view can go a long, long way. Psychologically speaking, I think it really comes down to like defense mechanisms in terms of if someone's trying to give you something that activates your defenses, like, oh, what are you saying? I'm a bad person? Are you saying that I'm not sensitive? Are you saying like taking that defensive accusatory position, then you're not going to be open to whatever someone's having to say. However, if you take a more abstract lens, especially with something that can be as uncomfortable as talking about mental health and symptoms of mental illness, then there's at least a level of space between you and what's being discussed, and that allows you the breathing room to take it in and to kind of mull it over and play with it a little bit and really think about it, as opposed to being put on a defensive stance. So that's been my experience. And then a lot of the games that I have seen that have done difficult topics, including mental health, tend to have that more abstract component. Not that it has to be that way, but I definitely do find that it's the most effective, and it also tends to be the least problematic in terms of having to have informed consent and content warnings about what you're making.
And I just before I transition this, we did have a question from the chat about basically how to craft your game to be helpful to those who struggle with trauma at your table. And I'm going to throw this one to Dr. Megan because I know this is literally what you do.
Yes.
So, like, what advice would you have for someone, especially in light of what Dr. Kelli just said, about how to craft your game to potentially even be helpful to somebody struggling with trauma at the table?
Well, the very first thing, and this is something I know both you and I say a lot, is if you're not a psychologist, don't be a psychologist at the table. Like, that is not your job as the dungeon master, to be the therapist or psychologist for your friends and players. You don't want to do that. That is very, very bad.
You don't want to do that even if you are trained. You don't want to be that person who's judging and analyzing everybody when they haven't asked you to.
Yeah. And that brings me to the second part, which is consent in gaming. And got to bring up what's been a hot button topic, but which I think is bizarre, which is this idea of consent in gaming. And Monty Cook released this amazing PDF a few weeks ago now of just called Consent to Gaming. It's free. Go to Monty Cook Press and get it. But what I love is on the very last page is a checklist that you can give to all of your players. And it uses basically like a stoplight system, green, yellow, red, of what is okay to have in this game. And I like it because you can either have it be anonymous, or you can have the players put their names on it. And it could just say stuff that they want to see in the game, stuff that they don't want to see in the game. Because, Kelli brought this up at the very beginning. We play games for fun. It's fun. And you don't want to be reminded of your traumatic experiences during your time to have fun, especially if it's not something that you want to bring up. Now, sometimes friends might say, I'm struggling with this thing and I'd like some practice at it in the game. Maybe it's I'm struggling standing up for myself and I'd like to be given the opportunity in the game to have my character stand up to NPCs. And as long, I think it's a good idea for dungeon masters to ask a few more questions about that, to go like, can you help me understand exactly what you're looking for here? And then also creating some sort of system to go, if it's not going the way you want, how we can stop it, how far we push things and what we don't do, and everything like that. And it's doing that stuff when we have that clear communication with our players, I think things go really well. Well, and Dr. B, you can actually speak to this, because we had something happen on Clinical Role that was going to be potentially triggering, and I gave you guys all a warning about it beforehand, and I don't think it spoiled the game at all from your standpoint.
No, and I'll say that. I mean, I'll going back to that question of how to be helpful with to friends who are suffering from traumas. In my mind, is you just be a good DM.
Yeah.
Have that good, you've talked about this on Psych at the Table. 90% of the answers at the table, if there's any conflict or anything, is talk to your players. Have good communication, and I know you've done that many times. And I know I'm fairly certain I recall this, Dr. Kelli, that you have that as a component of the RPG that you designed as well, is that there's clear communication with the people at the table.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, and just that idea of like talk with your players, be open with them, because I think a lot of dungeon masters fear, we don't want to spill all of our secrets and ruin that delight of discovery that our players can have. But saying something like, so if for those who watched Clinical Role this last week's game, a few NPCs died. But before we went live, I was talked to the players. I was like, guys, there's a really it is probably going to happen that NPCs are dying tonight. And is that going to bother you guys straightly? Because if it is, I'm not going to do it. And then we did check in at the end of the game as well. And so having those clear check-ins with those kinds of things just ensures that you're playing a game that's fun and everybody can enjoy. And consent does not decrease the fun, it increases it. Because as a dungeon master, it decreases your anxiety. You're not sitting there going, God, it's, I know one of my players was in the army and has done 3 tours of duty, and they're getting ready to go into a part of the module that involves a war zone. And I really hope I don't bring up something that they don't want me to bring up.
I know one of my favorite slides, and that I was at Games for Change talking about the ethics of empathic design for digital games, because empathy games is all the rage over in that space. And I think one of the most important slide was get informed consent. The second most important slide was trauma is not your plot twist. It's not an Easter egg. It's someone's lived experience. And so if you're like, well, I can't tell them about this because it'll ruin the surprise, then you're doing it wrong. There are some things that can be surprises and twists, but there are trauma is not, that's not one of them. And so just the idea, again, as a new player to, tabletop RPGs in general, I've already felt like the need to have a close, trusting relationship with the person who's running my games. And the couple of times that I have run games, I have definitely tried to make that space. Because when you're going into that play space, there's a lot of, you have to trust that everybody is going to observe by the same rules of the game. If you're playing soccer, everybody trusts that everybody on the field is not going to use their hands unless they're the goalie or doing a throw in or a kick in. And if you do break those bonds of trust about the rules, then the play stops. I mean, that's exactly what happens. And it's the same thing in sports, in tabletop games. And so that the idea that you could have a DM who isn't communicative, again, this is probably just my naivete, that just doesn't make sense to me. Maybe historically when the DM was more of a god than a supporter of play experiences. But at least right now from what I've done as a player and as a DM, I can't imagine not having that kind of back and forth feedback with the people I'm playing with.
Well, and even thinking about some of the earliest research on role-playing games, the first one, being the book Shared Fantasy by Gary Allen Fine in 1983, he makes the comment that the DM is a god. However, a god without believers is not really a god at all. So he comments on, while yes, there is a power dynamic between the DM and the players, there's also a symbiosis that the DM has to act in such a way to keep the players interested and keep the players' trust.
He can be a god, but he has to be a benevolent god.
Right. He has to.
Not the Old Testament God. No. New Testament.
We're all groovy God.
Yeah.
Well, so kind of taking a step backwards and talking to something that Dr. Kelly said about taking an abstract concept. Dr. Megan, you have literally done that at times.
Yes.
And created representations of various mental health challenges. And I hope you'd like to share that with us.
Yeah, I wrote one monster by myself, and I actually wrote another one with the help of someone I was working with. It was part of their therapy, we made this monster. So we made the depression monster, and I've made my anxiety monster. Because I've been pretty open about this. Anxiety is mine. It hangs out with me all the time, and I just deal with it. I ride this high energy wave of anxiety through my life, and talking about what it is. And it's been really awesome to take those and to turn them into these monsters. Like the anxiety monster, it's actually on D&D Beyond, and I think I have it open for the community to see. It's called the INMI, INMI. And what I love about it is it's a teeny tiny demon, about this big, But what it does is it casts a shadow that looks enormous, and it really terrifies the characters. And as they're attacking the shadow, of course, it does nothing to the actual thing casting the shadow. And I also have it written in that once you start actually attacking the enemy and it gets to about half its hit points, it uses one of its abilities to escape. And it will always come back. Like, you can fight it for a while, but it's always going to come back.
I've used that thing in game, and my players hated that thing so much.
Yeah, mine too. And they've fought it a couple times. They're like, "Oh, this is that thing, isn't it? I hate anxiety." But the depression monster, I love this. We made it a golem, but it is an ooze golem. And what it does is it can envelop you, and even after you escape, you're slowed and you look paler and you have a hard time connecting with people. But we also made it that you gain buffs for saving against its condition by your party cheering you on and by your party standing by your side and coming with you. That for every person cheering you on, you get to add a D4 to your save roll to try and break the condition of it. And it's been really funny because it does create this thing of like, what did you not like about that monster, about the condition it put on you, and talking about how difficult it was and just trying to work through that and the challenges of it. And so it can create some interesting conversations too.
Well, and I think about what Dr. Kelly said in how it represents abstract concepts. And, you, in doing that, you're not actually explaining the literal symptoms of depression or anxiety. One of the analogies that I've used in working with people in the past about anxiety is that fear is functional. Fear keeps you safe. Anxiety is a whole lot of false alarms going off all the time. Mm-hmm. But you don't have to explain that because you did it in such an allegorical way with that shadow, and then boom, it runs away.
Yeah.
It's absolutely fantastic. We did have a question from the audience. What do we think about the X card system? And for those of you who don't know the X card system, actually, you know what, Dr. Megan, you have a great explanation for the X card system. You can do it really quickly.
Sure, yeah. So X card system is you have a card or a token that you use with an X on it. And that means I am not comfortable with what's going on and we need to stop. And you do a full stop of whatever was happening at the game. You tend to back up a little bit and go to something else completely and walk away from it. So that's what it is. Yeah.
Pretty simple.
Yeah, pretty simple. I use a so that's what the X card system is, raw, basically rules as written. I modify it a little bit. I learned this from the lovely players at Tales of the Mist, where they do O, N, and X. O is okay. N is for basically like a heads up. We're getting into something I'm not super comfortable with, but I'm okay right now. But if we go much further, I'm not going to be okay. And then the X is we're going to go away from this. And I like that. But then there's another method called the Luxton method, where you also talk about what's going on. And I integrate that into how I do the X card. But keep in mind, the games I run are more therapeutic and more transparent. And so that's sort of the bend of them. But we'll let the player share as much as they're comfortable with on why they're nixing whatever the thing is we're nixing and what's going on. It also allows for players to put up the X card and in a way to just, not as a way to like say we don't do this, but to go, whatever happens, we need to save this kid. This is super important to me as a human, that my character gets to save this kid or gets to help this family or whatever. And I think that's really nice because it can allow for the game to be fun and also a really good experience for the humans playing the game as well.
So, Dr. Kelly, you know, as someone who is literally an expert on game design, one of in my mind, this is just a ridiculous criticism of the idea of the X card system, of the Luxton method, of any of these, forms of consent, that, oh God, it takes away from the fun of the game. As an expert on game design, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's hard to have fun if you feel unsafe. And I think that is incredibly important, especially when you are face to face with other human beings. If I feel unsafe playing Dark Souls or whatever game I'm on, I can turn it off, I can walk away. If I'm at a table with 5 other people, the social demands of that situation may not really allow me to do that. And if I'm in a therapy session, I probably would have a harder time walking away because I should be there and I want to be there. I like the idea of being able to put the brakes on. And this conversation reminds me so much of what's going on in the digital space around, well, we don't want content warnings because it's going to ruin my artistic vision. I am an artist and I am exploring whatever it is. And so I shouldn't be bound by your silly ethics. And it's a difficult conversation because you do want to explore these things, but you also have to do it in a way that is safe and respectful of the people who are going to be on the receiving end of it. And so I always like to think, if you want to make something for yourself, you can do whatever you want. But the second you release it to a population, you have an ethical obligation to not do them harm. And so I think the X card system is interesting in that. I also find it really interesting because LARPs, live action role plays, most of them have universal rules as well as like game specific rules. And one of them was just like Dr. Megan was saying, where there's like the okay sign, and then there's like flat hand is I'm not quite sure about this, and then like a thumbs down is get me out, I'm done. So sometimes they are rules that are given to the people before they go into the LARP. Sometimes they're built into the mechanics of the LARP itself, which is really fascinating. And so it's funny that this idea of consent seems to be so odd because it does have a long track history, at least in LARPing. And I wish digital games did this more. I like to use this example of What Remains of Edith Finch, which is this amazingly beautiful game that's really all about like death and how we process ourselves and life and death. But there is a scene where something really, really sad happened, and it way too close to home for me. And I was like, I actually got to the point I had to hand the controller to somebody else and walk away because it was too much. And I didn't even have that trauma. It was just something that was a little too close to my real life, because it had to do with a small child about the same age as my small child. And I couldn't do it. I wish I could have skipped it. I wish I could have just hit the skip button. And then that's when I always get the pushback from designers about, but then you're ruining the narrative experience and the artistic expression is not going to be there. And it's definitely a challenge to find that balance. But at the end of the day, to me, a person's safety and well-being is more important than your artistic vision.
Yeah.
Well, and that brings up, that brings up one of my pet peeves. And, back when I ran regular therapeutic role-playing game groups with a lot of teenagers, of course, these teenagers adopt the lexicon of the internet, and often in a, mocking sort of provocative way. And anybody who had been at the table long enough knew, as somebody walked in and said, "Oh my God, I'm so triggered," what the lecture they were about to get. My longtime players knew that lecture well. So you've both talked about the idea of being safe at the table. Mm-hmm. It's just a game, though. What's potentially unsafe about it?
So football's just a game, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, but I'd like to think there's less of a risk of concussion with D&D.
Well, wait, can I just do one thing before we jump to that?
Yeah.
Sorry, my brain sometimes is slow to think of things. When we were talking about examples of playing games, specifically with trigger warnings, the adventure modules that came with Kids on Bikes did a great job of listing out what the trigger warnings were for each of the modules in it. And so it was great. It was like one of the very first things after the title, trigger warnings of kid violence, alcoholism, whatever. And then that gave you that option of, do I want to read this module or not? It was very, very, very well done. So sorry, that was
no, that's a good example. And and I'm sure we'll come back to this because I think Kids on Bikes, as well as the playtest version of Pathfinder, have both done a really good job of bringing light to the idea of inclusivity at the table, including mental health and neurodiverse representation. But, coming back to this idea, first of all, what is being triggered for anybody who might not actually know? Either one of you can answer this because I know you both know this because this is a
Yeah.
technical term.
So it's a term that's been co-opted, like so many psychological terms have been. I'm going to go binge watch Netflix. Yeah. Anyway, ultimately, it means that someone is experiencing a re-experience of either traumatic symptoms, feelings. They could be physical, it could be mental, it could be emotional, and that situation is bringing up content for them that's being either resurfaced because they've actually experienced it, or like future focused, which was in the case of my Edith Finch playthrough. It didn't happen to me, but oh boy.
Oh no, that scene, I could totally, that scene hit me, and I don't have your situation.
Yeah. Situation. His name is Grant. He's not the situation.
He's a situation. No.
He's adorable. But yeah, so that's it, in general, meaning that, in a clinical sense, if you were to trigger somebody, it's basically you are triggering the re-experience of some kind of traumatic or mental illness related symptomology. So for someone who's anxious, you might trigger off an anxious spiral where they just begin to ruminate and then just spiral down into like the sad thoughts of forever. The same thing with depression. If something happens and someone has their depression quote unquote triggered, maybe they won't be able to get out of bed, or whatever it is. There's kind of like a step backwards in progress, even if it's just a small one.
Yeah, I could say, like, I've been reminded of trauma in games before, like tabletop games, and it was no fun for me. And like the hard thing too is, like, as careful as you can be and as transparent as you can try to be, you're never aware of all of your own stuff and what's going to hit you in an odd way. My DM was narrating something, and it brought up secondary trauma that I have from treating so much PTSD while I was in the Army. And we play via Roll20, actually. So we're playing the tabletop game digitally, but like this narration came up of something that just hit me, and suddenly I was back in that situation, and like I ripped my headphones off and just left the room. And like it took me a little while to calm down and come back and say, like, I'm better now, but I wasn't then. And that, like, my Sunday nights are fun, and being reminded of that stuff was not fun. And so it decreased the fun for everybody, and it made my dungeon master feel bad, which I didn't want. So like it hurt friends, it disrupted the flow of our play. And so like it's good to know this stuff and to have things built into place so when this stuff comes up, it doesn't happen and you don't disrupt play.
Or if it does come up, because no matter, like you said, sometimes it's like, surprise, that there's a process in place and people know like how to respond to it. You could have put up the stop sign, hopefully you wouldn't have had to rip your head. I mean, obviously do whatever you need to do to feel safe. Yeah. But like if it was coming up and you could have stopped it before, like right when you got that first inkling of this is not okay. Like if you'd been able to stop it right at that beginning point, I think it would have been a very different experience.
Yeah. Yeah. Like it probably would not have stuck in my head. So.
Yeah, been buried in there. Huh?
So when we're talking about the concept of safety, we're really talking about as we're playing the game, we're talking about really helping the people at our table, our friends, avoiding the re-experiencing of traumatic events in their life. We're talking about helping them avoid the re-experiencing of existing psychological symptoms, or potentially in the case, I was going to say that something else, but I realized that's a trauma too. So yeah, so basically, the safety that we're talking about is just trying to be good friends.
Yeah, and that's I think the part that baffles me whenever there's the pushback to all of this stuff. It's like, we're talking about being kind to your friends. Like, why is this something that's getting you offended? Like, don't you?
Why are you so triggered?
Like, what? Yeah, it's like, don't you want your friends to have a good time around the table, and don't you want some tools to help you ensure that your friends are having a good time?
Don't try to cramp my style, baby. I mean, that's the vibe I get from people whenever they're like, no, don't tell me what to do. Don't tell me what to do. It's I can just picture comic book guy in my head just going, I play the game I want to play.
And good for you. Right? That's fine. Not that's I'm a big fan of Reddit and hanging around on the different D&D Reddits, and like that's one of the things is like not every table's for everyone. Find the table that's right for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
No, that's always a good thing. But so at the same time, but I've also heard that one used as a defense. You don't like my table? Leave.
Yeah. Well, I think that comes back to, can you? Like,
Yeah.
you might have the only table. Like, is it coercive to try and get someone to leave? And what is your responsibility to that person? I would say if they're your friend, there's at least some kind of friendshipping responsibility that, hopefully you're not trying to make them feel bad. And, if you're in a professional relationship, like, between Megan and the clients she sees, she can't tell them to just GTFO.
Yeah.
That's not ethical. And so, like, the idea of if you don't like it, you can leave. Just trying to wrap my brain around why would you want a table where that's the feel? And maybe there's like some power struggle going on, blah, 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 Freud. But no, it comes back to Freud. Let's be serious. Yeah, just that it's my way or the highway. That to me is not a quality of a DM that I would ever want to be around. And so I'd probably leave anyway, even if the content wasn't objectionable.
Yeah, and there's one thing too, like, I think it's also how that message is delivered is a really big thing, because if it is just if you don't like it, leave, like that's combative and that's not cool. Like,
right.
Because we actually had a similar conversation to this in building Clinical Role, which was, I run a high fantasy game. If you're looking for steampunk, if you're looking for spaceships, I'm not your DM. And just, that's all there is to it, and it's not an offensive thing. It's just like, if you want a game where this stuff is going to happen, those aren't the games I run, and that's totally fine if you want that. It's just, you're not going to find that at this table. And so to get that, again, going back, that was informed consent, though. That was done as part of session 0.
Right. Well, and I know that there was a comment from Oba Crazy in the chat that knowing the roller coaster has passed its safety inspection doesn't make it any less fun or thrilling.
Yeah. I really like. I might steal that. I will set you though, Oba Crazy.
No, that's. I think I might steal that too. But just as a DM, the idea that I want to put on a fun time for my players, and if I know what's not fun for them, why would I do it?
Yeah.
That just baffles me.
I also think there's an important thing to pull out is that, we talk a lot about fun, but also keeping in mind that it doesn't have to be fun. Like, a lot of really amazing games are not fun. What Remains of Edith Finch is not fun. There's a lot of powerful experiences that are uncomfortable, and they make you be reflective and really think about your decisions, like The Walking Dead, those Telltale games. I don't know if fun is one of the top 10 words I would use to describe them, but they're still an important gameplay experience. Yeah. But there's a big difference between having something that's uncomfortable because it's causing you to stop and think and be reflective, and something that is like harmful and like harassment or anything like that comes up in a game.
Yeah. So
all that to say, you can deal with difficult topics.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. It doesn't have to be slapstick all the time.
Right.
Because and I'm going to keep bringing up Clinical Role just because, well, I'll plug it, but also it's available for people to view. It's like, we've had some really gut punching emotional moments in there, but like some of those are like the best moments in that game. And it was still fun and amazing. And we've had a lot of slapstick too.
Yes, we have.
but
you almost made me cry on camera.
Yes.
I won't say why, but you almost made me cry on camera, and that was just a fantastic moment to have. And it sounds like that we're really drawing the line between evocative and traumatic / triggering.
Yes. Yeah.
And in that context, I appreciate Riot Punch for asking this, and I believe a very honest and earnest way. Riot Punch says they don't understand what can elicit a trauma response that would cause someone to leave a table. So, what would you say to that, to someone who is earnestly asking what could cause a trauma response?
So I think first it's important to define trauma, at least it's in the way that I tend to use it is trauma is an experience that any experience that significantly disrupts your life. Like there's a moment where it was before the trauma and after the trauma, and whatever that event is, and that's the traumatic event. In terms of what would make someone leave the table, so I haven't left a table, but back to the video game example. So content warning, having to deal with the death of a child. The game is What Remains of Edith Finch. It's a narrative adventure game. You are exploring this house about the Finch family, and you play through vignettes of each of the family members on the days of their death. And so I'm about halfway through the game. I'm like crawling through this attic, and I get to this room, and it opens up, and there's a crib, and it's a nursery. And I'm like, I literally said, "Dear God, please don't make me do this, because you are the reason that every character dies. You know, your hands literally are what propel the players forward." And what happens is that the little boy, his name is Gregory, he's 1 year old, he's in a bathtub, and he's playing, and he's having a great time. And then as you play, the way it moves through the game is that you hit like a frog, and the frog hits the faucet. And mom is distracted by an emergency somewhere else. And so the bathtub fills up, and, you know, they don't show it directly, but Gregory drowns. And it's awful. And like just thinking about it, it's really, really difficult for me. And my son was the exact same age. He loved rubber ducks. He was in the bathtub. And that's where I had to hand the controller to somebody else and say, I physically cannot do this. So I feel like that's an example of me walking from the table, even without it having been a traumatic event. Like it wasn't traumatic, but it was triggering, because it triggered all those feelings of, oh my God, what if that happened to my baby? Because the parallel is so clear. Another really good example is the game, That Dragon Cancer. It's a game that a father made about his son who had terminal cancer. And in the game, you play as that father trying to care for your sick son. I have never played the game. I will never play the game, because even talking about it, I had to talk to my master's class about this. And I literally almost started crying in front of all of my students because I was explaining the game mechanic involved in one of the scenes, and it just like chokes me up so much. So that to me is another example of something that is so emotionally overpowering that I can't actually be present. I emotionally shut down, and I have to walk away. I did come back to Edith Finch after someone else got me through it. And so I was able to come back to the table, so to speak. But like, I'll never play That Dragon Cancer. It's too close to home and the what if.
Mm-hmm. That's I mean, so that's those are two tremendous examples. Dr. Megan, do you have any examples that you can think of?
Yeah, and I could say for my filter from this is going to come from the military, because I was in the Army for 6.5, 7 years, and went to Iraq, did all that stuff, and worked with a lot of vets, you know, coming back and trying to put their lives back together. And so one of the interesting things about trauma is the stuff that you latch onto and the things that become those trigger moments, you know, like having to hose out the back of a car that has your best friend's brains all through it. Sorry, this is going to be graphic. I was in the Army. I forget, my filter's a little different than other people's. For one guy, it was Pokemon cards. One of the bases got hit, and it was during a shift change, and they were going and putting out the fires of all of the chews that had gotten hit, and one of his best friends got killed. They found pieces of them in various places, but like the thing that was saved was their binder of Pokemon cards. And so like that was their thing. Like anytime they saw Pokemon cards, they would bring up their friend, and like that. So like it's again, like, and Kelli, you put it really, really well. It's like, it's that moment where you can't connect with the here and now anymore. Your brain has taken you into time. And like, I saw a talk by, I always get his name, Vanderkolk.
Oh yeah, Vanderkolk. Yeah,
Vanderkolk. Okay, yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Right. He's expert in PTSD, and he was showing his different brain scans of people with PTSD. And what he was pointing out was there's a part of our brain that lights up to show where we are in time. So when we're being mindful, it's a certain part. So when we're in the moment, it's this part. When we're having a memory, it's a different part. And when we're daydreaming about the future, a different part lights up. When you're experiencing a trauma memory, none of them light up. Your brain does not know where trauma lives in time, which is really interesting and has some cool implications for treating trauma. But like, if we think about why is it a problem in gaming, because you need to pay attention to what's going on at the table. You need to pay attention to what's happening on the screen. You need to know what's going on. And if you physically, your brain is no longer in the moment, your brain is no longer connected to the here and now, you can't be playing and you can't have fun. And that's not good.
I actually thought of an actual tabletop example. I'm so proud of myself. So in the tabletop game that I made for work, one of the stories we had written for it was actually written by Jack Birkenstock from the Badhana Group. So yay, good for you guys. You guys are awesome, which is why it's so funny that it's his story that did this. But the story started out with like the backstory of a family who was having fertility issues. And then when the woman finally got pregnant, the child was born and like had SIDS.
Oh,
that's just the backstory. And I'm like, Jack, can we have an alternate? Can we have an option here? And so he was like, oh my God, I didn't even think about that. I'm like, it's okay. Like, we all have these spots that we just don't see. And for, if you don't have kids, it's probably going to be harder to see those particular issues. And if you don't have military experience, it's probably going to be difficult to see those kinds of issues, which is why it's so important to have multiple people feeding into the design of something, whether it's a video game, whether it's a tabletop game, whether it's a book, whatever it is, getting all those different perspectives and experiences to really represent what you're getting at. And so he wrote a couple other ones where, and again, so it was just the backstory. It was a really, really easy fix. And I'm so glad that we caught that early, because I know if I had sat down and that was how a game started, I would have been, nope. Any game that starts that way, like where the kid gets hurt or the dog dies, I'm out.
Well, and so this, kind of coming back to Riot Punch's original question really directly, hopefully Riot Punch and everybody else in the audience, you can see that it's not any one thing that could literally be triggering traumatic memories or, psychological symptoms in players. It could be just about anything. And that's the beauty of session 0, where you can plan out what is, or in many cases cannot go into your game. And I know Dr. Megan mentioned the consent module that's available for free for Monty Cook Games. That's just, I thought that was a brilliant summarization of something that of something that a lot of us do, and they just put it in one great PDF. Yeah. It was just so good. So I want to make sure we talk about this, and we've got about 13 minutes left. We all went through a lot of school. We all know we went through too much school.
Too much school.
27th grade.
Yeah, you went back for another degree, and yeah. I mean, bully for you on that one. You could not get me to do that.
I stopped at 24.
Yeah, same here. I'm done. 24th grade is enough for me. But let's say we've got a lot of folks out there who didn't spend their entire lives learning about psychology. We've got a lot of folks who really mean well, but don't necessarily know the specifics of mental health topics, mental health symptoms, or themes. So this is actually a question we got from Twitch, from the IDGM, or IDDM. What suggestions do you have for people? How can they do this? How can they respectfully and compassionately approach mental health topics or symptoms?
Be intentional. Think about it. So if we are just relying on ourselves to come up with it on the spot, it's not going to be very good. Mm-hmm. If it's not something we're incredibly familiar with and we know really well. working and thinking like, okay, I want them to interact with some new NPCs, and don't be afraid just to have your NPCs have some different quirks and things. Maybe it's you have somebody who has a hard time getting out of bed some days, and the storekeeper's there and some days they're not, and it's like, well, sometimes they can't get out of bed. And or just to think about it, write about it, and then like Dr. Dunlap was saying, have somebody else check on it, have multiple eyes on things, especially if it's your first or second early attempts at doing something. And again, like, understand that the mental health issue does not need to be the central defining feature of the NPCs. And again, I'm sorry, I'm going to be self-promotional here, talk about like this on Clinical Role. You guys just rescued a bunch of NPCs who pretty much all of them have some form of PTSD. And I was describing symptoms of it, but not in a way that was like, and these guys are experiencing flashbacks and this is going, it's just more subtle and just being it like part of the narrative description of their interactions.
So, in not just be intentional, but check in with others.
Yes.
And to see if it's done respectfully.
Mm-hmm.
And to not make it the single defining feature of them, to make them a fully multifaceted character that just also happens to have some of these mental health symptoms. And what's interesting about the way you described all those NPCs in that episode of Clinical Role, as well as the example you just gave, you gave behavioral examples.
Mm-hmm.
This person couldn't get out of bed. These people seem to not be paying attention to the world around them, like they're spacing out. And you didn't use the word PTSD, or in the case of not getting out of bed, I'm assuming depression.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you're not using those clinical words. You're just describing a behavior.
Yeah.
So,
well, I was going to say too, there to go to Critical Role, Matt Mercer's doing this well with one of the NPCs. He has the Ruby of the Sea. I'm forgetting the character's actual name. I think she has agoraphobia, just based on how he's been describing her actions in her life. And it's really well done in the descriptions of it. And it's really interesting to hear how he's describing this. It's like, oh, this is cool, how he's talking about this character and her struggles. So, but it's also like that. It's behavior. It's not saying she's afraid of going outside. It's as she's walking you out the door, when she's outside saying goodbye, you see her eyes darting around a lot and she seems uncomfortable.
So describing around the label as opposed to just using the label.
Yes.
Okay. But it also sounds like doing some homework ahead of time.
Lots of homework.
Okay.
That was going to be the first thing on my list is research. Like, get a foundation. If you want to go into an area that you don't have experience in, the very first thing you should do is some research. And it's the same thing if you wanted to do an environment that was like Tolkien-esque versus Doom. Like, you would probably do some environmental research around what that would be like and what to expect. I do think there's also something really critical about the idea of nothing about us without us. And so if you do want to do some kind of adventure that brings in mental health, or again, some other kind of either vulnerable population or something you don't know, bringing in somebody from that community, whatever that community might be, to be a part of that. And even if you are a member of that community, having other people who share it. So for example, if I wanted to make an anxiety game and I have anxiety and it's for me, that's fine. But if I wanted to run something that's representative of what anxiety is, I would want to talk to other people who also have anxiety disorders so that I'm getting a broader perspective of the diversity that comes up. Because one of the problems with mental health and games in general is that they tend to be very one note, like flashbacks, PTSD, sad, depression, worried, anxious, like just boom, boom, boom. They're one symptom. Then it's all the person is. I literally have a list. Like I was writing.
I was wondering what you were writing.
Excellent.
Down.
The other one is there's this idea of if it's not your story to tell, don't tell it. But that doesn't mean you can't include people and be inclusive. So if you wanted to have NPC that had mental health issues, I think that's fine as long as it's done in a very you've done your research and it's done in a caring way. If you wanted to run a campaign based on mental illness and you have no experience, that might be a little more subject to scrutiny, at least from me. Like, I can write a story about, my experience as a woman in game dev. Like as a white woman in game dev, I absolutely can write that story. But if I was to say, write the story of a woman of color in game dev, I can't do that. That's not my story. That's not my experience. But, having a woman of color in my woman in game dev game, I think is, it's a fine line and it's not perfect. So yeah, just to go back to the idea of, is it your story to tell? And if not, what can you do to mitigate any kind of issues that might pop up? And maybe it's not your story to tell. And then the last thing was I actually wrote a paper last year all about mental illness in video games, specifically in video games. But it outlines a way of thinking about mental health representation in games in general, mostly from a research perspective, which is why the research on mental health in games is so terrible, is because it's just terrible. But there's the idea of one-dimensional, two-dimensional, and three-dimensional representations. So one-dimensional being it is an aspect, and that if you took it out of the game, it would completely disappear and nothing would change. So for example, psychos in Borderland, like they're literally called psychos. And if you called them Bobs, nothing in the game would change. It is just a throwaway thing. Whereas I think it was Megan, you were mentioning earlier, like if someone gets up and like takes their meds in the morning and moves on, like that's such an inconsequential thing, but it's still a positive representation of mental health and caring for oneself. So, but if you removed it, nothing really would probably change. Then there's two-dimensional, which is the mental health issue is core to the character or the scenario. And if you took it, everything would fall apart. So this is your homicidal maniac type of thing of, if Kefka wasn't crazy, then he wouldn't be a character. But you can also have it on the positive side too. So there's a couple characters in Night in the Woods. I guess that used to be my go-to example. I gotta rethink that now. But like it's kind of core to who they are. And then there's your three-dimensional. These are like fully fleshed out realizations. So on the good side would be something like Senua from Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice, who is a three-dimensional character. Or you could think about in Skyrim, there's the islands of Mania and Shigarath, who is the god of madness. And it's this interesting exploration of mental health and how we construct it and like how it's playing out in this fantasy world. But it's deep and it's rich and it's super, super interesting.
Which was incidentally one of the early inspirations for Gardens of Fog.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah.
I love the Shivering Isles.
That was actually one of the things one of the examples we brought in.
Yeah. And so that all that rant just to say that there's so many different ways to incorporate. It can be characters, it can be environments, it can be mechanics. Again, like sanity meters, no, but there's other ways to bring those mechanics into your gameplay. And so it's not your token, oh, look, there's the crazy old hermit down the street. Let's go ask him what he's up to today. And he'll give us a quest. There's so many different ways to get at these kinds of representations. And okay, I think that's everything on my list. So so we're running out of time.
Well, to summarize that, and I think there's some really wonderful takeaways with a lot of wonderful elaboration. And that one of them is what you said: nothing about us without us. The idea that, especially if you're trying to incorporate a story that's not your story to tell, you need to one, do research beforehand, and two, talk to people who have experienced that so they can give you their input. Similarly to how, actually you brought up Hellblade, similarly to how Hellblade was discussed. I
do want to throw in there, nothing about us without us. It's not mine. It's like it's a hashtag slogan thing, typically used in the accessibility movement. It's not mine.
Okay.
But I think it is applicable to mental health as well as
absolutely
physical.
Well, I'm public about my autism, and I can certainly write about my experience with autism. But as one of the common slogans in the autism community is that if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. And even you brought up the complexities of mental health diagnoses. The example I like to bring up is major depressive disorder. There's 9 symptoms, of which you must meet 5 out of 9. How many permutations of that can you have? Somebody answered that once, and it was in the thousands. But the idea that if you are a player who doesn't have experience with mental health, clinical topics, do your homework ahead of time. do some research. There's a lot of really good. Actually, there's a module I came across recently in the DMs Guild that is, it's so brilliant, and it's called I've Been, written by Mackenzie Der Armas, and it is written about the struggle with depression in a really beautiful, symbolic way. And aside from, of course, I'm biased, Gardens of Fog, it's the only one I know of that really approaches it in a sensitive, caring manner. And I'm waiting for chat to show up with all sorts of other examples, which I would love to get. So please correct me, chat.
I think it's also important to ask why. Like if you want to have a character that has a mental illness or a physical limitation, or, you know, something that is going to draw attention in terms of quote unquote otherness, whatever that might mean for your story, really being curious as to why you're doing it. Is it for shits and giggles? I don't know if I can say that.
Yeah.
Is it for poops and giggles? Or is there like, you know, is it the princess that you're having to go save and it really could be anything? Or is there something really core to having that specific symptomology and that specific presentation? And if so, then you're probably on a better track than if it's for poops and giggles.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So okay. So basically don't throw it in just to be, you know, intriguing. Ooh, they have trauma, but it could be anything else. That's that one-dimensional representation.
Yeah.
That's great. That's absolutely fantastic. Before we end things, any parting words or last thoughts that either of you have?
We had a question a while ago about session 0. I'll say I did do a segment on session 0 for psychology at the table. It's on the Geeks Like Us YouTube, but typically I would revamp my session 0 now that Monty Cook's Consented Gaming is out, and definitely use the checklist from that as something. Asking people about what type of game they want to play. Again, what they want to see in a game, what they don't want to see in games, how they expect the world to work are all good topics. And then also covering whatever safety mechanisms you're going to use in the game. So whether it's an X card, whether you're just going to go with veils and lines, which is where all the characters get to create their hard lines and the game never goes there. And then you have stuff that happens behind the veil or off screen. Those are all a bunch of great things to have in your session 0.
And Cypher of Tyr also brings up Your Best Game Ever, another book by Monty Cook Games, which is a fantastic book. It's mostly about how to be a great player, but there's a lot of great DMing tips in there as well.
I have 2 copies. I've yet to read one of them.
I'll also throw out there's the TTRPG Safety Toolkit that you can find. There's also Consent and Community Safety Manifesto, which is specifically for LARP. But there's a ton of crossover. And the one about that one that I like is that it does focus on community, not just like individual sessions, but in like building the larger community around your role playing.
So that's good. The LARPing community does an amazing job with that. They really historically have done an amazing job, and they're still going. So, you know, they must be doing something right.
Yeah.
I
think we'd also be remiss if we didn't mention the upcoming critical course coming out from Game to Grow.
Oh yeah, well. No, they're gonna have some good stuff in there as well. Good. It's a good call.
So keep an eye out for that. Should be coming hopefully early next year.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing the final version of that. But thank you both so much. I think this has been informative. I think this has been stimulating, and I hope the audience got a lot of great information out of that as well. I know I always learn something when I'm talking to the both of you. But thank you, audience, for being here as well. Please stay tuned to the rest of the weekend for Roll20 Con as they continue to raise donations for TakeThis mental health mission of educating and destigmatizing mental health matters. And so thank you all for caring so much, and hopefully you'll have a great day.
Yeah, thank you all so much. And thank you, Dr. B.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye, everyone.